The tension was palpable as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett locked eyes with Bill Maher across the studio. For weeks he'd been taking swipes at progressive politics, but tonight she wasn't letting it slide. What began as friendly banter quickly escalated into a verbal chess match that left the normally quick-witted host momentarily speechless, and the audience erupting. The familiar blue lights of the Real Time with Bill Maher studio dimmed as the show went to air. Bill settled into his chair with the confidence of a man who had hosted this program for over 2 decades. His signature smirk played at the corners of his mouth as he introduced his guests for the evening. "Please welcome Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from Texas's 30th District," Bill announced, gesturing toward the striking woman who walked onto the set with purposeful strides. Her red blazer stood out against the blue backdrop, a power move that didn't go unnoticed. The audience applauded as Jasmine took her seat, exchanging pleasantries with the other panelists, a conservative commentator and a tech entrepreneur, before turning her attention to Bill. "Great to have you on the show, Congresswoman," Bill said, his tone casual yet pointed, "especially in these emotional times for progressive politics." Jasmine smiled, her posture relaxed but alert. "Thank you for having me, Bill, though I'm curious what you mean by emotional times." Bill leaned forward slightly. "Well, it seems like every policy discussion on the left these days comes with tears and outrage. Don't you think that's getting in the way of actual governance?" The audience shifted uncomfortably. Bill had been building this narrative over several episodes, criticizing what he called emotional politics with increasing frequency. "That's an interesting framing," Jasmine replied, her voice steady. "What some might call emotional, others would simply call engaged. People care deeply about issues that affect their lives. That's not a weakness. It's democracy working as intended." Bill chuckled, but there was an edge to it. "There's a difference between caring and turning every policy disagreement into personal trauma. Don't you think that's happening more on your side of the aisle?" "I think that's a convenient narrative that ignores reality," Jasmine countered, her calm demeanor contrasting with the charged words. "When people's health care, voting rights, or bodily autonomy are threatened, they respond with appropriate concern. Labeling that as overly emotional is a way to dismiss legitimate grievances." The conservative commentator jumped in. "But Congresswoman, you have to admit that some of the rhetoric from progressives is over the top. The constant claims of existential threats are often backed by data," Jasmine interjected smoothly. "Climate change is an existential threat. That's not emotional. That's scientific consensus." Bill raised his hands in mock surrender. "I'm not talking about climate change. I'm talking about the way progressive politicians, particularly younger ones, seem unable to separate their personal identities from policy discussions." Jasmine's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what exactly do you mean by that, Bill?" The studio grew quieter as the audience sensed the shift in tone. "I mean that bringing your personal experiences into every debate, whether it's about race, gender, or whatever else, doesn't always lead to the best policy outcomes," Bill replied. "Sometimes objective analysis matters more than how something makes you feel." Jasmine nodded slowly, deliberately. The camera caught a flash of determination in her eyes as she gathered her thoughts. "Let me ask you something, Bill," she began, her voice measured but firm. "How many times have you been the only person who looks like you in a room where decisions are being made about your community?" Bill hesitated, caught off guard by the direct question. Because that's been my reality for much of my career," she continued. "So when you talk about separating personal identity from policy, you're asking some of us to pretend our lived experiences aren't relevant. That's not objective. It's privileged." The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. "I'm not saying lived experiences don't matter," Bill protested, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "But there has to be room for rational debate without accusations of—" "Without accountability?" Jasmine challenged. Because that's what this conversation often boils down to. When I speak about issues affecting communities of color with passion, I'm labeled emotional. When my white male colleagues pound their fists on tables, they're showing leadership. The tech entrepreneur tried to interject with a both sides argument, but Jasmine wasn't finished. And let's be clear, she said, leaning forward slightly, this isn't just about race. Young women in politics, especially women of color, face this double standard constantly. Our passion is labeled as anger. Our expertise is questioned. Our concerns are minimized as identity politics. Yet when we try to speak calmly and rationally, we're accused of being calculating or inauthentic. Bill's expression tightened. He was no stranger to contentious interviews, but something about Jasmine's measured confidence seemed to unsettle him. Instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Come on, Congresswoman," he said with a dismissive wave. "Nobody's saying you can't be passionate. But don't you think there's something to be said for keeping emotions in check when crafting legislation that affects millions?" The audience held their breath, sensing the trap in his question. Bill's strategy was clear. Paint her response as either an admission or evidence of the very emotionality he was criticizing. Jasmine paused, taking a sip of water before responding. The studio lights caught the determination in her eyes as she placed the glass down and looked directly at Bill. "What I think," she began, her voice resonating with clarity that commanded the room's attention, "is that there's something deeply revealing about men who confuse a woman's competence with emotionality." The studio fell silent. Bill's smirk faltered as her words hung in the air. Several audience members audibly gasped, while others broke into spontaneous applause that the producers quickly tried to hush. "That's quite an accusation," Bill finally responded, his voice tighter than usual. "I've been having these conversations for decades with guests of all backgrounds." "And yet," Jasmine countered without missing a beat, "you consistently frame passion from certain voices as hysteria, while treating it as conviction from others." "That's not an accusation, Bill. It's an observation backed by patterns." The conservative commentator cleared his throat. "If I may—" "Actually, I'd like to hear the Congresswoman finish," Bill interrupted, a challenge in his eyes. The camera caught his knuckles whitening as he gripped his notes. "You're implying I have some sort of bias. Care to elaborate?" Jasmine's expression remained composed, but there was steel in her voice. "Your framing of progressive politics as overly emotional isn't new or unique. It's part of a long tradition of dismissing marginalized voices by attacking the messenger rather than engaging with the message." Bill shifted in his seat. "That's not what I'm doing. I'm critiquing a style of politics that prioritizes feelings over facts." "Are you, though?" Jasmine asked, arching an eyebrow. "Because when Senator Graham shouts during hearings, or when your friend Joe Rogan gets worked up about cancel culture, I don't hear you calling them emotional. The passion is only labeled problematic when it comes from certain quarters." The audience murmured in agreement. Bill glanced at them, a flicker of concern crossing his face. "Look," he said, attempting to regain control of the conversation, "I'm an equal opportunity critic. I've called out plenty of people on the right for being irrational." "Being irrational isn't the same as being emotional," Jasmine noted. "One suggests a lack of logical thinking. The other implies an excess of feeling. And you consistently apply the latter to progressive voices, particularly those of women and people of color." Bill's jaw tightened. "You're putting words in my mouth." "Am I?" Jasmine reached into her portfolio and pulled out several printed pages. "These are transcripts from your last 5 shows. You use the words emotional, hysterical, or outraged 14 times when describing progressive politicians or activists. 12 of those instances referred to women or people of color." A low whistle came from somewhere in the audience. The tech entrepreneur leaned forward, suddenly interested. "You came prepared," Bill said, his tone hovering between impressed and defensive. I always do, Jasmine replied simply. When you've spent your career having your intelligence and competence questioned, you learn to bring receipts. The producer made a slashing motion across his throat. They needed to go to commercial break, but Bill waved him off. The show's format, the producer began from off stage. Can wait, Bill finished, surprising everyone including himself. He turned back to Jasmine. I think the audience deserves to hear this out. Jasmine nodded, a flicker of respect in her eyes despite their disagreement. What bothers me, Bill continued, isn't the passion. It's the refusal to acknowledge that sometimes issues are complicated, that not everything is a moral crusade. Some things are complicated, Jasmine agreed, and some things are crystal clear. The problem is when people with privilege get to decide which is which. Bill's frustration was becoming visible. So any criticism of progressive tactics is automatically invalid because of my privilege? No, Jasmine said firmly. Criticism is valid and necessary. But when that criticism consistently takes the form of tone policing rather than engaging with substance, it becomes suspect. The conservative commentator jumped in. With all due respect, Congresswoman, there are legitimate concerns about how identity politics has fractured discourse on both sides. Jasmine turned to him with practiced patience. Identity politics is just politics for anyone who isn't a straight white man. When farmers lobby for agricultural subsidies based on their identity as farmers, nobody calls it divisive. When veterans advocate for better health care based on their identity as veterans, it's patriotic. But when black women advocate for maternal health equity based on the fact that we're dying at 3 times the rate of white women during childbirth, suddenly it's identity politics that's fracturing discourse. Bill attempted to wrestle back control. But don't you think some of these conversations have become unproductive? The immediate accusations of racism or sexism when someone disagrees. Is that what you think is happening right now? Jasmine asked, her voice quiet but firm. Because I haven't accused you of anything other than applying a double standard in how you frame political passion. A double standard that you're implying is based on gender and race, Bill pushed back. A double standard that data supports, Jasmine corrected. Studies consistently show that women, especially women of color, are perceived as more emotional when expressing the same level of passion as their male counterparts. The tech entrepreneur nodded. The research on this is actually quite robust. My company has had to address similar biases in our performance review systems. Bill looked genuinely taken aback, not having expected his other guest to side with Jasmine. He regrouped quickly. Fine, he conceded, though his tone suggested it was anything but. Let's say there is a double standard. Doesn't that distract from the actual policy debates we should be having? On the contrary, Jasmine leaned forward, sensing a shift in the conversation's dynamic. Acknowledging these biases is essential to having honest policy debates. Otherwise, certain voices, often those most affected by the policies, get discounted before they can even make their case. Bill's face tightened with frustration. So what's the solution? We can't just… Listen, Jasmine interrupted, her voice suddenly softer, but no less commanding. The solution begins with listening. Not just waiting for your turn to speak, but truly hearing perspectives different from your own, without immediately categorizing them as emotional or irrational. The studio grew quiet. Even the usually restless audience seemed to hold their collective breath. Bill stared at Jasmine for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Fair enough, he finally said, leaning back slightly. I'm listening. Something in his tone had shifted. Not complete surrender, but a crack in the armor. The audience sensed it too. When you dismiss passion as emotionality, Jasmine continued, you're essentially saying that caring deeply about issues is incompatible with rational thought. But for many of us, these aren't abstract policy debates. They're discussions about our lives, our communities, our futures. Bill nodded slowly. But surely you'd agree there's a line between passion and histrionics? Between legitimate critique and, say, cancellation? Of course there is, Jasmine acknowledged. Nobody's arguing for histrionics. What I'm saying is that the line gets drawn differently depending on who's speaking. A raised voice from someone like me gets labeled as anger far quicker than it would from my colleagues. The conservative commentator shifted uncomfortably. But doesn't focusing on these perceived slights distract from substantive debate? Jasmine turned to him with a measured gaze. They're not perceived slights. They're documented patterns that affect whose voices get taken seriously in policy discussions. And ignoring them doesn't elevate the debate. It simply preserves an uneven playing field. Bill cleared his throat. Let me play devil's advocate for a moment. You've been doing that all night, Bill, Jasmine interjected, with the hint of a smile that caught him off guard. A ripple of laughter moved through the audience. For a moment, Bill looked genuinely amused. Touché, Congresswoman. But here's my concern. In a world where everyone is afraid of saying the wrong thing, doesn't dialogue become impossible? People aren't asking you to be afraid, Jasmine replied. They're asking you to be thoughtful. There's a difference between censorship and accountability. Some would say that line has blurred, Bill countered. Some would, Jasmine agreed. But consider this. For generations, certain voices have been systematically silenced or dismissed. What feels like censorship to some feels like finally being heard to others. The tech entrepreneur nodded. In our company, we've found that the teams most resistant to inclusive language are often those who've never had to think about how language affects them. Bill turned to him with a skeptical expression. So corporations policing language is progress now? Not policing, the entrepreneur corrected. Evolving. The way we communicate changes as we learn more about how our words impact others. That's not political correctness. It's just social growth. Bill sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I've built a career on challenging orthodoxy, left or right. If we can't question the prevailing wisdom, however well-intentioned, aren't we just replacing one dogma with another? Questioning is essential, Jasmine said, her voice earnest. But question the powerful, not just the marginalized who are finally gaining a voice. Challenge orthodoxy, absolutely, but recognize when you're actually defending it. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Bill's expression suggested he was genuinely considering her words. You know, he said after a moment, most guests come on this show ready to recite talking points. You came ready for an actual conversation. That's because change doesn't happen through talking points, Jasmine replied. It happens through difficult conversations where people actually listen to each other. Bill leaned forward, his posture changing subtly. Okay, Congresswoman, I'm listening. Tell me what you think I'm missing about the progressive approach. What many critics miss, Jasmine began, sensing the genuine shift in his attitude, is that acknowledging identity isn't divisive. Pretending it doesn't matter is. When I speak as a black woman in Congress, I'm not injecting race and gender into politics. Those dimensions were already there, shaping policies and outcomes long before I arrived. She paused, gauging his reaction before continuing. The passion, you see, isn't emotionality overriding reason. It's the natural result of lived experience informing intellectual understanding. And frankly, Bill, we need both. Bill nodded slowly. I can see that perspective. But don't you worry that some people use identity as a shield against legitimate criticism? Some might, Jasmine acknowledged. Just as some use accusations of identity politics as a shield against confronting systemic inequities. Neither approach serves the democratic process. The conservative commentator, who had been quiet, spoke up. So how do we move forward? How do we have these difficult conversations without everyone retreating to their corners? By doing exactly this, Jasmine gestured around the studio, by having conversations where we challenge each other's assumptions without questioning each other's right to be at the table. by recognizing that discomfort is part of growth. Bill laughed suddenly, surprising everyone. "Well, you've certainly made me uncomfortable tonight, Congresswoman." The audience laughed along with him, the tension in the room dissipating slightly. "Good," Jasmine replied with a genuine smile. "Comfort rarely leads to change." Bill turned to the camera. "We need to take a break, but when we come back, I want to continue this conversation. Congresswoman Crockett has given us a lot to think about." As the cameras cut away, the audience broke into spontaneous applause. Several people stood, creating a ripple effect until much of the audience was giving Jasmine a standing ovation. Bill, after a moment's hesitation, stood as well, extending his hand to her. "That was illuminating," he said quietly as they shook hands. "That's all any of us can hope for," she replied. When the show returned from the break, something had shifted. The conversation that followed was still challenging, with genuine disagreements expressed on both sides, but the tone had fundamentally changed. Bill asked questions that suggested actual curiosity rather than merely setting up counterpoints. Jasmine responded with the same measured confidence, but acknowledged the complexity of certain issues. By the time the show ended, social media was already ablaze. Clips of the exchange spread rapidly across platforms, with particular focus on Jasmine's comment about men confusing competence with emotionality. Hashtags formed organically. "Competence, not emotion," and "Taj Crockett School's Maher" trended nationally within hours. The following morning, news outlets picked up the story. Conservative media framed it as "Congressman Crockett attacks Maher's show format," while progressive outlets celebrated Crockett's masterclass in setting boundaries. The reality, as usual, was more nuanced than either narrative suggested. 3 days later, Bill addressed the viral moment on his podcast. "I've been thinking a lot about my conversation with Congresswoman Crockett," he admitted. "I don't agree with everything she said, but she made some points that deserve serious consideration. Maybe I have been applying different standards without realizing it. That's worth examining." For her part, Jasmine declined most interview requests about the exchange, simply stating, "The conversation speaks for itself. I hope it encourages more people to speak their truth calmly, but without apology." A month later, when Bill's show featured another panel discussing progressive politics, viewers noticed a difference. He still challenged his guests rigorously, still injected his trademark sarcasm, but the framing of the questions had subtly shifted. He was listening differently. And across the country, in offices and classrooms and dinner tables, people who had watched the exchange were having their own conversations about whose passion gets labeled as emotion, about the possibility of disagreeing without dismissing, about the power of standing firm with grace instead of backing down.